begin, I would like to acknowledge the people of the Kulin Nation as the traditional owners of the lands on which Monash University campuses stand, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. So, mind wandering. When our minds wander, our thoughts and attention drift away from the here and now, away from what we're currently doing. And according to some estimates, mind wandering occupies up to 50% of our conscious waking lives. So it has huge significance within our human consciousness. In recent years, there's been an explosion of research on mind wandering, and this arguably began with a conceptual proposal. So back in 2006, Jonathan Smallwood and Jonathan Schooler proposed that part of the reason why mind wandering up until that point had escaped mainstream attention could be that research addressing the issue had been framed in the context of a variety of disparate constructs, including task-unrelated thoughts and images and stimulus-independent thought. They then proposed that by bringing these different strands of research together and referring to this phenomenon as mind wandering, a term familiar to the layperson, they might be able to elevate the status of this research into mainstream psychological thinking. And that proposal was enormously successful. There's mind wandering research really took off as a unified field from that point onwards. And this paper alone has been cited almost 3,000 times. And yet, there continues to be profound disagreement as to the defining features of mind wandering. Mind wandering is variously defined as task-unrelated and or stimulus-independent thought, as weakly constrained thought, as unguided attention, as involving a loss of mental autonomy. And I think across proposals from different disciplines, from psychology, from the neuroscience of mind wandering, from philosophy, but also from proposals from different groups, what we can see here is a tendency to define mind wandering in negative terms, in terms of what it lacks, and also to define it in contrast to and as a deviation from task-focused forms of thought and focused and or guided attention. At the same time, there continues to be a focus on the costs of mind wandering rather than its benefits. So the list of proposed costs of mind wandering is long, including things like reading comprehension, education, costs in education settings, thriving, and many more. Whereas one of the most promising proposals for a benefit of mind wandering, which is creativity, has not been substantiated by newer research. So a famous study by Benjamin Baird and colleagues that proposed that mind wandering might promote creativity has recently failed conceptual replication. A plausible analysis or explanation of this could be that operationalizing mind wandering as task-unrelated thought and investigating it in a laboratory setting using experimental tasks is not going to be appropriate to bring out potential benefits, including benefits that are of a more long-standing nature and bring out the personal meaning of mind wandering. So this might well be an artifact of the way that mind wandering tends to be studied. There's also disagreement about the type of definition that is needed to look at mind wandering. So one group following Paul Selly in a TICS paper has proposed that mind wandering is a natural kind and that we might take a family resemblance view towards mind wandering. So in this case, we would define mind wandering in terms of overlapping subsets of similarities. We would talk about graded membership in the mind wandering family, but there would be no set of necessary and jointly sufficient conditions of mind wandering. Whereas others disagree that this family resemblance approach creates a definitional haze, that abandoning the search for essential and distinctive features of mind wandering, at least at this stage of research, is premature and that the family resemblance view broadens mind wandering to make it synonymous with all forms of thought. I think that what is needed in this situation is a reset, and we really need to focus, I think, on two central questions. The first is, can we define mind wandering in terms of its positive characteristics, in terms of characteristics that it has rather than ones that it lacks? And two, can we define mind wandering in a way that does not cast it as a deviation from task-related thought and or focused attention, but acknowledges it as a primary and in some sense more basic phenomenon in its own right? In this talk, I'll be focusing on the second question. I think answering the second question, and I hope to be working towards an answer and approach to that second question, will prepare the groundwork for finding an answer to the first one. That is a definition in terms of its positive characteristics. The way I propose to approach this question is by introducing a botanical metaphor of mind wandering. So here's a first pass. Our minds are gardens. They contain wild and cultivated plants. Among the wild plants of our minds, we find prototypical cases of mind wandering. And among the cultivated plants of our minds, we find cases of task-related thoughts and focused attention. So my task in this talk is going to be to show that this is a helpful metaphor for thinking about mind wandering and related wild mental states, and that this is going to be a useful tool, not necessarily for providing quick and easy answers to the questions and challenges that we have in mind wandering research, but for thinking about them and approaching them from a fresh perspective. So I think the metaphor by my own lights is going to be successful if firstly it helps casts mind wandering as a primary and basic phenomenon in its own right. And I think that by focusing on mind wandering as the wild plants of our minds, we are coming a step closer towards this, because while we can contrast wild and cultivated plants, wild plants are not deviations from cultivated ones, but vice versa. Wild ones are the primary phenomenon to look at here. And I think secondly, the metaphor is idea and research generating. And I hope to provide you with examples showing that that is the case. So here are a few specific questions that I'm going to be addressing throughout this talk, and I'll be drawing from recent research, including from my own group, to illustrate my answers to these questions. So one, can the wild cultivated distinction meaningfully be applied to mental states at all? Two, can we distinguish different species of wild mental states and how do they relate to mind wandering? So in other words, can we take a step towards regarding mind wandering as part of a bigger set of wild mental states rather than investigating it in isolation? Can the metaphor guide investigation of the costs and benefits of wild mental states, including mind wandering? I think this is a particular need, given that we continue to have a possibly methodologically induced focus on the costs rather than the benefits of mind wandering. Should we have conservation reserves for wild mental states? Are they things worth conserving and protecting, and what might that look like? And I'll at least have a speculative example, a candidate for something that might count as a conservation reserve for wild mental states. And can the metaphor help direct attention to under-researched questions about mind wandering that are nonetheless important? So to begin then, what is the difference between wild and cultivated plants, and how might we begin to fill out this distinction? Here I propose to look to a popular web application called the iNaturalist. So the iNaturalist is an online social network, that's how they describe themselves, of people sharing biodiversity information to help each other learn about nature. It's a citizen science approach. Users identify plants and animals to generate research quality data for scientific research studies. And iNaturalist seems to be a promising place to look for a first pass at a definition of wild versus cultivated plants because it's primarily aimed at observing wild organisms. So it's not just aimed at plants, it's also aimed at animals. But what they want is really observations of wild plants and animals because those are going to be the ones that then feed into research studies. So getting clear on that distinction is clearly is in their best interest. Moreover, I think that a citizen science approach of this type is fitting if we consider that experience sampling studies of mind wandering and wild mental states are going to actually be working in a way that is quite similar. So here too, we are asking users, participants, to identify mind wandering when it occurs and report it in a particular way. So it's a similar challenge, really, to what researchers studying mind wandering, for example, have to researchers wanting to get citizen scientists to identify wild plants and animals. So here's what iNaturalist has to say about the wild captivated distinction. So checking captive cultivated in the app when you log an observation means that the observation is of an organism that exists in the time and place it was observed because humans intended it to be then and there. So here are some selected examples which are focusing on plants. A poppy in a garden would be cultivated. Also cultivated would be a tree planted 1, 10, or 100 years ago by humans, as would be plants that grew from seeds that were planted in the ground or scattered. In contrast, wild plants would include weeds or other intended plants growing in a garden, would include the descendants of plants that have been planted by humans, would include garden plants that reproduce on their own and spread outside of the intended gardening area, as well as living organisms dispersed by the wind, water, and other forces apart from humans. One thing is worth pointing out at this stage about the wild cultivated distinction, and that is that what is being compared here, the relevant similarity, is not primarily between the plants and the mental states per se, but the measures we do or don't apply to their respective cultivation. In other words, what marks the primary difference in whether an individual counts as wild or cultivated is whether we have applied certain measures to its cultivation or not. And it is this type of cultivation that is the main focus of the metaphor that I am proposing, and that I believe is similar, interestingly similar in both cases of cultivating plants and mental states. And it's also then the case that the targets of cultivation are individual plants as opposed to species. And the same then for individual mental states. So the next question, now that we have a rough and ready distinction between cultivated and wild plants, is then whether that distinction can meaningfully be applied to mental states. Well, we have here a now much cited paper by Paul Selly and colleagues proposing that there is a distinction between mind wandering with and without intention. Intentionally initiated mind wandering in this context refers, intentional mind wandering in this context refers to instances of mind wandering that were intentionally initiated. For example, I allowed my thoughts to wander on purpose. And Selly and colleagues survey a number of studies to show that firstly, there is a large proportion of overall mind wandering reports that are intentional. So overall unintentional mind wandering is more frequent than the intentional type, but both form a significant proportion of mind wandering reports in total. And they also tend to occur in different contexts. So if people are engaged in an easy and potentially boring task, they're more likely to allow their minds to wander on purpose to something more interesting and entertaining, perhaps. Whereas if participants are engaged in a more difficult and demanding task, they're going to try to concentrate, and they are less likely comparatively to engage in intentional mind wandering. Mind wandering is thus more likely to be of the intentional type because no matter whether you're trying to pay attention or not, your mind is prone to wander at some point anyway. Now, the possibility of intentional mind wandering has generated huge controversy, both in the science and in the emerging philosophy of mind wandering. And there's big controversy specifically as to whether mind wandering can meaningfully be considered as intentional at all. Some say yes, self-generated and task-unrelated thought is open as to whether these thoughts were initiated with or without intention. Others clearly answer no. Mind wandering is, by definition, unintentional mental behavior. Perhaps intentional mind wandering is even a conceptual contradiction, because as soon as you intend to have any thoughts whatsoever, that intention makes that thought related to your task, and so no longer task unrelated, and so no longer a case of mind wandering. Some say it depends on the degree of cognitive control. So perhaps mind wandering is subject to weak, deliberate constraints or weak forms of cognitive control. And it then becomes the question where to draw the line between too much and too little control. Or maybe it depends, as others have argued, on the type of cognitive control that you can have. So Irving has proposed that mind wandering can be intentional insofar as it involves actively cultivating an unguided mode of attention. There's also been a proposal that mind wandering can be intentional insofar as it involves an omission of exploitative control. So there are different proposals here. And again, this is just to say that there's disagreement on how to even approach this question. But I find it interesting that even though the philosophy of mind wandering overall is still a quite small and emerging field, especially compared to the now large scientific investigation of mind wandering, this is really as close as we get to a philosophical controversy on mind wandering, is the notion of, or the question of whether it can be intentional. And I also find it interesting that actually the only two other talks at this conference to be talking about mind wandering are both focusing on this notion either of guidance of mind wandering or of agency and passivity. So that question is really at the heart, or appears to be at the heart of those two talks as well. And I'm really looking forward to them. They're going to be in the next parallel session for those interested. Now, it seems that iNaturalist, at least according to the official guidelines, has a pretty clear answer as to whether mind wandering can be intentional. And that is, well, if a thought was intentionally initiated, if a plant was planted in a pot, and it's cultivated and not wild, so perhaps then we should not count it as mind wandering. But in fact, we have seen from the foregoing discussion that the question is far more complicated, and it's actually far more complicated in iNaturalist itself. So what looks like a straightforward distinction for plants has actually generated a heated and ongoing debate among users. So we find numerous threads focused on the wild cultivated distinction in the forum of iNaturalist users, and many of them then generate counterexamples, borderline cases, thought experiments, conceptual distinctions. It's really a quite interesting debate to have a look at, and I just want to show you two of my favorite examples that I've found so far. So here's a user posting the following example in a thread on the question, are garden weeds wild or cultivated? Here's what they have to say. I have a tray of pansy seedlings which I sowed. By any definition, they are cultivated. But among them is a sweet pea seedling, which I did not intentionally sow in that tray, although I have other trays of sweet pea seedlings, which I did sow. The first time I saw that rogue seedling, it was not cultivated by the iNat definition because I didn't intend it to be there, and I didn't plant it. But the moment I decided to let it grow, to water and tend it along with the pansies until it was ready to be pricked out, it became cultivated, a kind of Schrödinger seedling. Continues, my garden is full of weeds because I choose to let them stay. I dig up some dandelion and dock, but allow others to grow. I set my mower to height to encourage daisies to flourish. As a gardener, I would say they are all cultivated because they are tended to in some sense. On my iNat observations, they are not because they have not been planted. Another user got so infuriated about the continuing discussion about wild versus captivated around the official guidelines that they did the following. We've had numerous long and tortured discussions, the user writes, here at INAT Forum about when observations should be marked as wild versus captive. Unfortunately, after all of those discussions, we seem to be no closer to consensus. In an effort to determine which criteria have the most support for determining wild versus cultivated status in disputed cases, I've created a survey using Google Forms. So among the top 5 criteria rated by users for the cultivated versus wild distinction were organism was proposed, born, germinated under human control. So that's in accordance with the official INAT guidelines. Population receives care or cultivation from humans. This is consistent with what we saw the user write about the sweet pea seedling. Or organism is dependent on humans for survival. So I'm not proposing that we take these results at face value, but I do think that this discussion and the example of the survey show that the guidelines do not necessarily reflect what users care about. And because this is a community-based citizen science project, what users care about seems hugely relevant because they are going to be the ones that generate quality data for further research. And similarly, I think in mind-wandering studies, we should actually care about what participants think about distinctions such as intentional, unintentional mind-wandering, because they are going to be the ones that identify and report the relevant instances that then inform our scientific studies. Another thing that we can take, at least tentatively, from this discussion in the INAT forum is that planting does not, according to users, seem to be necessary for cultivation. A plant can count as cultivated for reasons other than having been germinated and planted in a particular place. So here's then a first pass at a definition. Let's say that cultivated plants are plants that are subject to deliberate, active, and direct measures to induce, select, and refine or retain certain characteristics in a stable way. So cultivation requires some direct activity and intervention with a certain intent, and it's not a one-off. By contrast, wild plants are plants that grow freely. Where and how they grow is independent of such measures of cultivation. And we can say the same for mental states. Mental states are states that are subject to deliberate, active, and direct measures to induce, select, refine, or retain certain characteristics in a stable way. Whereas wild mental states are states that develop freely. In particular, when and how they occur or unfold is independent of such measures. So the next question then becomes, can we distinguish between different kinds and degrees of cultivation, keeping these examples from the plant world in mind, but now for mental states? And here I'm going to draw from a study that is currently under review that I did together with my former PhD student Manuela Kierbach and Jonathan Robinson here at Monash. I think this is an appropriate study to start with because it looked at spontaneously reported or self-caught dreams and mind wandering in a naturalistic environment, so in everyday situations. And I think this is as close as we can get to studying mind wandering in the wild. It was also the first study. It is also the first study to compare spontaneously reported dreams and mind wandering in an everyday context, as opposed to probe-caught ones. So we had a screening questionnaire, we gave participants detailed instructions, and then we asked them over a period of 3 weeks to report a dream and a mind-wandering episode once per day for a total of 10 days. So in the morning after awakening, they did an audio recorded report of a dream and answered a questionnaire. And then once in the day, when they noticed that their minds had wandered, they did the same for mind wandering. And here I'll focus on the questionnaire data. Questionnaire was administered via an app developed at Uni Melbourne. We had 21 participants and a total of 340 questionnaire responses. And the questionnaire was quite detailed, but here I'm really just going to pick out two of the questions, so the question on intentional onset and the question on ongoing control throughout the episode. So what we found was firstly that both for dreaming and mind wandering, the majority of instances were initiated without intention. So this corresponds to the Paul Selly definition of intentionally induced mind wandering. But then there was also, unintentional mind wandering, but then there was also a significant proportion of intentionally induced mind wandering. That's the one that corresponds to intentional mind wandering, according to Selly, and a smaller proportion of intentionally induced dreaming. When we looked at control within the episode, the pattern was somewhat different. So here we found that for mind wandering episodes, a majority of mind wandering was either mostly controlled, somewhat controlled, or mostly uncontrolled. Whereas for dreaming, the majority of dreams were either completely or mostly uncontrolled. So slightly different pattern here. So again, I think this is at least a first step towards showing, and to my knowledge, this was the first study to distinguish between intentional onset and ongoing control over mind wandering and dreaming. So I think this can be done, and it leads to interesting response patterns. We might ask whether other factors of cultivation, for instance, cultivating context and or environment, might be taken into account to get a fuller picture of cultivation versus wild mental states. We might ask whether cultivated mind wandering should still count as mind wandering, whether mind wandering should be confined to wild individuals. I don't think the study furnishes an answer to that, but I do think it suggests a new way to think about that question and to move forward. Namely, we could then ask, well, are cultivated and wild instances of so-called mind wandering relevantly similar in a number of other relevant respects? If overall they are similar to each other, then we might want to say that whether they are cultivated or wild doesn't make that much of a difference. And we might want to allow that a subset, for instance, of mind wandering can be wild while another subset is cultivated. But if, for instance, intentionally induced and or controlled throughout, mind wandering was very different from the more uncontrolled and unintended versions, perhaps we would want to confine mind wandering to the side of wild mental states rather, and say that cultivated, intentionally induced, or controlled instances of mind wandering should not be called mind wandering at all. We might also begin to ask whether there are differences in how particular species of wild mental states respond to cultivation. For instance, we do seem to see a different pattern here for dreaming versus mind wandering. So again, these are things that we'll want to look at in more detail in future work. These are just first steps towards filling out the metaphor and thinking about these questions in more detail. But for now, I think we can see how the botanical metaphor offers a fresh perspective on difficult questions, such as different kinds and degrees of cultivation and how they might apply to questions, for instance, about intentional and unintentional mind wandering. So the next question I want to ask is whether we can distinguish different species of wild mental states and how they relate to mind wandering. I would propose that mind wandering is just one among a number of wild mental states. And it's not necessarily the case that all cases of mind wandering, all wild, are wild. I would like to leave open that some of these and also the other examples might count as cultivated. Again, I think this is for future work to determine. But even so, we can see that mind wandering will be distinguished from other forms of distraction as a wild mental state. So this is another candidate, something like bottom-up stimulus-driven attention. We can think of extended or embodied versions of wild mental states. So there have been some recent proposals, for instance, by Jelle Braunebach and Regina Fabri, that absent-minded smartphone use might constitute a version of extended mind wandering. We can at least say that absent-minded smartphone use and perhaps doodling would count as potentially embodied forms of wild mental states. We could look to cases of intersubjective influences on wild mental states involving, for instance, musical or other forms of improvisation or brainstorming together with a group. We can look beyond wakefulness to dreaming, for example. But the example that I want to look at here is one about mind blanking. So attentional lapses, you might think, and this has often been done, especially in older studies of mind wandering, was that there was an assumption that attentional lapses while completing an experimental task in a lab would be synonymous with mind wandering. But in fact, the situation is more complex and there are distinct kinds of attentional lapses. Mind wandering involves thinking about something other than the task, whereas sometimes when people's attention has lapsed, they will also say that they weren't thinking about anything, that their minds were blank or empty. So it seems, based on a small but growing literature, that mind blanking and mind wandering have distinct phenomenological, behavioral, and neurophysiological profiles. We looked at this in a study led by Thomas Andrian, who was then at Monash. And what we did here is we asked participants to complete a sustained attention to response task in which they would press a button in response to certain numbers and then withhold a button press, withhold a response in response to other numbers. We interrupted them roughly at a frequency at every minute and asked them to report where the focus of their attention had been just before the interruption, whether it was on task, task focused, whether it was off task or their minds were wandering, or whether they were focusing on nothing, in which case we said that they were mind blanking. What we found was that when people said that mind blanking, the subjective reports of mind blanking were associated with a particular type of error in the SART task, so behavior became more sluggish. People failed to respond to go trials with a button press. And this was also associated with sleep-like slow waves, so-called, what we proposed could have been so-called local sleep in the back of the head. Whereas when they were mind-wandering, behavior was more impulsive. They committed omission errors, so they would press the button on no-go trials, and we found a correlation with sleep-like slow waves in the front of the head. So again, subjective reports associated with differences in behavior as well as with different neurophysiological signatures, but still suggesting a unified account of sleep-like slow waves occurring in different parts of the head, explaining distinct or predicting distinct types of attentional lapses. But the situation for mind blanking is actually a lot more complicated. Much as is the case for mind wandering, there's a variety of different definitions that have been proposed and a variety of different ways in which mind blanking has been operationalized, ranging from the lack of conscious awareness, complete blank, to intentional mind blanking, think of nothing as best you can, to focusing on nothing. And it seems plausible that at least a subset of mind blanking reports might also be what you might call memory blanking. So perhaps a thought was had, but just forgotten, and that then leads to a report of mind blanking, even though in fact there might have been an episode of mind wandering. In a recently submitted paper that I wrote together with Thomas Andrian and Antoine Lutz and Athena Demerzi, we tried to survey these different definitions and approaches to mind wandering to move towards a more unified account. One thing that we've also been working on, and this is still very much preliminary, is trying to aim towards a more detailed phenomenological description of mind blanking. So this is work conducted together with Emma Demschar and Thomas Andrian. And what we did here is we used something very similar to the initial SART setup that I just talked about a few minutes ago. But now participants did the SART task at home at their computers in a quiet environment. Experience sampling happened 4 times at a frequency of every 10 to 12 minutes. And following the experience samples, Emma then did microphenomenological interviews with the participants, which lasted between 5 and 20 minutes. And these interviews are then currently being continued by her and being analyzed. But she kindly allowed me to to talk about some preliminary findings. So this is highly preliminary, but it looks like based on the interviews that she has conducted so far, there is actually a heterogeneous variable phenomenology that underlies mind blanking reports. Sometimes there are descriptions of a gap in experience or time. It's almost like short-circuiting for a split second. I lost a little bit of time. I went forward in time for a little bit. It's like a tiny little gap in memory. And I didn't even see the screen. Some participants describe an absence of all content or a void. During the blank, there's nothing, just a void, absence, it does get quiet. Some describe mind blanking as a visual experience with reduced content. I feel my eyes glazed over. I stopped looking intentionally. I was just mindlessly looking in the direction I know I'm meant to, but not trying to take in what's there. But presumably there's still some residual visual experience of the screen, for instance, happening. And others realize that they have miscategorized experiences as mind blanking. For instance, I was thinking I didn't know how long this block would still take, but now that you're asking me, yes, it wasn't a complete blank experience after all. So at least it seems that initially these microphenomenological interviews can start to tease apart potentially different subsets of mind blanking and help us better understand its phenomenology as potentially identify miscategorized or misreported instances. So I think we can see how we can start distinguishing different species of wild mental states from each other, as well as exploring their relations. So the next question I want to address then is whether the metaphor can guide investigation of the costs and benefits of wild mental states. And here, consider the parallel between weeds and the alleged costs of mind wandering. So generally, what we mean when we talk about weeds is that weeds are wild plants that are unwanted in a certain context, such as a weed in a veggie patch, which will then be removed. It's a wild plant that you don't want to have in that particular place. And this is similar to mind wandering, where there is a primary task. This, almost by definition, is always the kind of situation where mind wandering is going to be a weed. And so, seen in this way, it's not at all surprising that operationalizing mind wandering as task-unrelated thought is going to bias research towards its costs. It's much as if you tried to understand the benefits of wild plants by studying weeds in a veggie patch. That's not going to be a fruitful approach. So to understand the benefits of mind wandering, we need to look to appropriate contexts. But I think we can say something more specific about weeds in relation to wild mental states and their respective costs and benefits. And specifically, I would like to ask, well, are there then examples of wild mental states that can always be considered as weeds? Or is it really just dependent on the context in which they occur? I was interested to find out that actually in Australia, the understanding and definition of what counts as a weed is quite different from the definition that I just presented in terms of weeds just being unwanted in a particular context. Because of the unique ecosystem that we have in Australia, here what is considered as a weed is any wild plant that is introduced, that is not from Australia, or even that is not local to that particular part of Australia. And these introduced wild plants then tend to be regarded as invasives and weeds. An example of this on the level of wild mental states might be absent-minded smartphone use. Again, there has been some recent philosophical discussion of absent-minded smartphone use in the context both of creativity and as a candidate for extended mind wandering. Jelle Brauneberg and Regina Fabri have argued that there is actually an interesting trade-off that occurs here, such that multimedia use and absent-minded smartphone use increase the time spent off task, but then are associated with less mind wandering. And that absent-minded smartphone use might share the costs, but not the benefits of mind wandering. So it might be that it's the type of mental state whose costs outweigh the benefits. Similarly, Carolyn Dicey Jennings and Shadab Tabatabayan have argued that absent-minded smartphone use and digital technology use may hamper creativity because they bias us towards exploration, idea generation at the cost of exploitation and idea evaluation, where both idea generation and idea evaluation, both exploration and exploitation, are crucial to creativity. So if you upset that balance, for instance, as they argue that is done through digital technology use, you might actually be doing that, be hampering creativity. So I would then want to suggest that absent-minded smartphone use is a candidate for a wild mental state whose costs generally outweigh its benefits, and that it can be considered as a weed in the Australian sense of being an invasive mental state. Absent-minded smartphone use then is not dissimilar in this idea to English ivy, as you see here in this picture on the slide, strangling a native tree fern. Clearly, there are benefits of smartphone use, but those benefits may be restricted to cultivated forms of smartphone use where there is a minimal risk of escaping into the wild. And a task for the future might be thinking about how we can prevent smartphone use from escaping and whether that is always the case. For instance, smartphone use in young people and developing minds might be the type of thing that too easily escapes in the wild and then becomes a problem. Conversely, native wild mental states may require protection from such invasives and thus require some form of conservation. This is an idea taken from the finding that absent-minded smartphone use is going to increase off-task thought at the cost of mind wandering of other forms of wild mental states. So I think the botanical metaphor at least offers some suggestions on how we might move forward in thinking about the respective costs and benefits of different kinds of wild mental states. And the next question that I want to speculatively consider then is whether we should or could have conservation reserves for wild mental states. So what is a nature conservation reserves? Well, according to Parks Victoria, and the pictures that you see here are actually of a nature reserve at the bottom of the street where I live. They're small protected areas that function as a refuge for native plants and animals. They typically have a high degree of species richness and diversity, and may provide, even though they tend to be small, some of the only viable seed left for revegetation and threatened plants. So they're extremely valuable to have. And they work by allowing minimum human activity and intervention. So there's really just human intervention. And I draw this both from the webpage and having spoken to park rangers about this issue. So intervention will typically be restricted to weed removal and nothing else. So typically it's just plants and nature and animals left on their own to flourish and grow. And that's it. And typically they allow for much less intervention and tending than parks in that regard. So there's cultivation in the sense only of having a protected environment for wild plants and animals and pretty much nothing else. The plants, the individual plants within these reserves are then wild by lights of my definition. So what I want to tentatively propose is that we have an analog to conservation reserves in a certain form of meditation, namely do-nothing meditation. That might be describable as a form of conservation reserve for certain wild mental states. And you might think, but wait, isn't meditation a traditional form of cultivating the mind? As a traditional form of cultivating the mind just the opposite of wild mental states? Doesn't meditation just rule out the occurrence of mind wandering? Well, this is drawing from work that I did together with Toby Woods and Olivia Carter, where we looked at descriptions of different meditation practices and expert texts. What united these practices was that they aimed at a similar goal state, namely contentless or pure awareness, but they did so by using very different techniques and coming from very different traditions. So again, just pulling out one very selected finding, what we found was that they placed very different values on stability of attention and tolerance of mind wandering, respectively. Focused attention meditation, not very surprisingly, values stability of attention, but has a low tolerance of mind wandering, views mind wandering as a disruption, as you might have expected. Mantra-based meditation that we looked at had intermediate levels for both stability of attention and tolerance of mind wandering, but do nothing meditation, and I'll talk more about that in a sec, placed low value on stability of attention and had a high tolerance of mind wandering. So what we have now been doing together with Toby, who's doing his postdoc with me at Monash, is running a randomized control trial with 3 conditions. So do nothing, meditation, focused attention, and listening to an audiobook. And the participants that we had were all meditation naive. We had a single 15-minute session with initial instructions and then 8 minutes of uninterrupted silence. The core instruction for the do nothing participants was practice giving up the effort of doing. And from the results, and we're currently writing those up, there was at least some initial indication that they were moving into stillness. So moving towards the goal state of stillness, contentless, or pure awareness. Overall experiences during do nothing were described as positive, characterized by calm and ease. Interestingly, do nothing participants said the experience was less boring, and they reported more of an empty mind than was the case for focused attention participants. And post-session informal conversations suggested the following: 19 out of 55 do nothing participants spontaneously described their thoughts as being random, meandering, drifting, moving to different points or places, or otherwise moving freely. 10 out of 55 indicated they had moments or periods where thoughts were absent, there was nothing in their mind was blank and empty, thoughts would go and stop, or there was a gap. One participant said, I feel like all my life I've been thinking, and this is the first time I realized I do not have to think. So overall, the practice aims at inducing stillness. That is intentional. And insofar it is cultivated. However, and there is also a technique in the practice, in the sense that practitioners are asked to maintain a particular posture and relinquish the effort of doing anything. It's a skillful form of doing nothing. It is a practice, and there is, in this sense, a way of doing it correctly and incorrectly. However, there is no cultivation in the sense that I've introduced of deliberately, actively, or directly inducing or maintaining any particular mental state, because that would be a form of doing, and that would thus count against the practice. So there's cultivation only in the broader sense of creating a particular environment free from disturbance. And we can say that empty-mindedness and mind wandering in the context of the practice arises effortlessly and insofar is wild, but yet is closely related to the goal state of stillness. So I would say that at least speculatively, do nothing meditation is a type of conservation reserve for wild mental states, and more generally, looking to these meditation practices and their tolerance of mind wandering can refine our understanding of how mind wandering relates to cultivation in the form of meditation. I'm aware that I'm getting close to the end of the time. I'll just quickly wrap up by giving you one last example of how the metaphor may direct attention to under-researched forms of wild mental states. If wild mental states are not a deviation from, but prior to cultivated mental states, as is suggested by the metaphor, we can naturally continue to ask, who else has wild mental states? Do they play a role in the development of consciousness in humans? We might start asking how wild mental states change over the lifespan. As the gardens of our minds become more established, do we need to consider forms of cultivation that involve not occurrent standing intentions, indirect measures, and mental habits? That is, do we need to expand our understanding of cultivation? And do the types of wild plants that occur in more established gardens of our minds differ from those that occur at the beginning of our lives, and how? We can ask who cultivates our minds. Is it the diachronic self? Is it parents? What role do parents, teachers, meditation instructors, and so on play in cultivating our minds? But the example that I want to give of an under-investigated question here is slightly different. And this is drawing from work together with my PhD student, Jasmine Walter and Thomas Andrion. And this comes back to disorders of consciousness. So there's evidence from neuroimaging studies that suggests that some DOC patients who lack responsiveness to behavioral tests, and so on those measures on behavioral tests, are diagnosed as unconscious, yet maintain conscious experience. For instance, these would be the famous imagining tennis, imagining moving through a house experiments that have been widely discussed in relation to DOC diagnosis. But what their conscious experience is like is poorly understood. And in a recently submitted paper, we then asked the question whether DOC patients dream and mind wander. We survey evidence from dreaming and mind wandering in the general population, but also on sleep to architecture, default mode network, and lesion studies to argue that at least in those patients where there is already evidence that that there is some degree of consciousness being preserved, in those patients it might be plausible, or it seems plausible, that they also experience mind wandering and dreams. And more speculatively, we ask whether mind wandering and dreaming in at least some patients may even be the dominant mode of experience. If this were the case, it would have implications for well-being treatment and diagnosis. And while difficult to address, we think it's an important question to think about and investigate in future research. So I think in this regard, we can say that the botanical metaphor does, by looking at cases of mind wandering that are not just a deviation from task-focused thoughts and attention, does draw attention to new and important questions. Thanks for your attention. I'd like to thank the organizers and collaborators, my collaborators on these projects, colleagues at M3CS, as well as the local Strait Reserve Group for sharing their thoughts.